So about a week ago, we celebrated my favorite holiday, the release of a new Stephen King book, with the release of Fairy Tale. Now, critics are calling this the best Stephen King book in over a decade, which I don't know if that's true. I haven't read it yet, but I've actually liked a lot of his more recent books with The Outsider and Billy Summers. But it got me thinking, what is my favorite Stephen King book? What are my top 5? So for the beginning of October, of Spooktober, I wanted to break down my top 5 Stephen King books. I am a huge Stephen King fan. I've read a majority of his books. Granted, I haven't read them all, so there's probably a couple of your favorites that I haven't read that won't make this list. But this is mine, and we're just doing this for fun to get October kicked off. So if you read some books of his that you love that I didn't mention, please let me know in the comments. Alright, number 5 is Pet Sematary. Now, I actually didn't read this one until a couple years ago. It's one of his more famous books that kind of eluded me for a long time. And I gotta say, this surprised me. Now, as someone who recently lost a loved one, this can be a tough read. I know Stephen King himself has said that this is maybe a book he never should have written in the first place. And I can see where he's coming from, but as a fan of horror and stories that push the boundaries, I think this book is worth reading. In Pet Sematary, Stephen King is tackling a age-old dilemma, which is what happens when we die? Or how do we reconcile the idea that we are going to die? Some of the earliest stories in human existence, the story of the Garden of Eden or the Epic of Gilgamesh, wrestle with the idea of what happens when we die, and it struggles with this human desire of not being able to wrap our heads around death. How can someone just leave us? How can someone just be gone from our lives? And in Pet Sematary, Stephen King is grappling with that issue. Like the famous movie quote says, sometimes dead is better. And I think Stephen King does a great job getting you accustomed and acclimated to this family. I was actually surprised how far into the novel that the horror elements arrive when people start rising from the dead. It happens almost halfway, or maybe past halfway in the novel if I remember correctly, but you get to live the lives of these characters. You fall in love with the children, with the husband, with the wife, and then when tragedy strikes, you understand his desire to not let his child stay dead. I think Pet Sematary does a great job reaching into the human psychology, our inert desire to not let life slip away, that we want to cling to life. Our consciousness can only understand life because it's only ever been alive. And Stephen King grapples that beautifully. Alright, book number 4 is near and dear to my heart. If I could include the entire series it's a part of, it would probably be number 1. But since I only had to pick one book from the series, I decided on The Dark Tower, Drawing of the Three. This is probably the most entertaining and kind of page-turnery? What? This is probably the best page-turner in the series. It's almost like Stephen King wanted to take the best of the Lord of the Rings and the best of the classic Clint Eastwood westerns and maybe a bit of Harry Potter and put it all in a pot and mix together, and it's a great pop culture fantasy epic series that's pretty far out there. The reason I picked this as my favorite of the series is I think it's the most imaginative. I don't know where King got the ideas and images and pictures that he brings to life in this book, but basically it follows Roland after his encounter with the Man in Black, and he is drawing his quartet, or his basically ragtag group of adventurers, and in each one he has to open a door that leads into their mind and see through. Yeah, you can tell Stephen King was on drugs when he wrote this, but it's a blast. Overall, this is the most creative and imaginative book in the series, and it almost reads like a Steven Spielberg blockbuster, but in book form. Alright, number 3 might be a bit controversial, seeing as this might be number 1 for a lot of Stephen King fans, but I'm gonna have to go with The Stand. Coming in at 1,100 pages, this book is a lot. It's a post-apocalyptic good versus evil epic. Now, for those of us post-2020, post-COVID-19, this book could probably hit a little too close to home, but it's about a virus wiping out, I think, 99% of the US population, and the remaining people who were immune to the virus trying to rebuild society, either for good or for evil. Some of these characters in this book are some of the most likable and engaging characters Stephen King has ever written, which is why I think, though for 1,100 pages, it's one of the faster books to read. You're just so engrossed by these human beings, the characters he writes. But, like a lot of people have pointed out, the conclusion, the denouement, is a bit random and a bit of a letdown. Things just kind of escalate, and then the bubble bursts randomly, and you're just like, wait, what just happened? And you're trying to figure out where all those story threads came together. Basically, the whole novel explodes, like literally at the very end. But again, despite all that, despite the way it ends, these are some of Stephen King's most beautifully drawn characters, and it's an engrossing tale about good versus evil and why certain people go down the path they do. All right, number 2 is probably his most famous book he's ever written, The Shining. Breaking news, Stephen King is kind of a scary guy. Personally, I've never been too terrified by any of his books. The Shining is the exception. The empty hotel, the haunted halls, the ghosts, the father figure turning against his own family. It was genuinely terrifying. But what I love most about The Shining is it's actually a beautiful metaphor about overcoming addiction and your own personal demons. It's no secret that Stephen King himself had a drug problem, and I don't know all the details, but I'm sure it took a strain on his family. So the story of Jack Torrance moving into the Overlook Hotel and having the ghosts infect him and overtake him and turn against his family, I think reads as a perfect metaphor for his struggle with alcohol and maybe other drugs. But to get away from Stephen King, I think it's a story about anyone overcoming their ghosts. It's about the decisions and mistakes that haunt you. And though there are literal ghosts, I think the scariest ghosts in this novel are the personal ones. There are a lot of books that could have been number 1, but for me, my personal favorite, the one I love the most, is 11/22/63. 11/22/63 is King's take on the time travel story. Now, there's a lot of imaginative and creative twists to this that he adds. There's no time machine, there's no portal. In fact, how you get to the past in this book is by going into a diner. And it takes you to one particular day in the past. And this high school English teacher, along with the owner of the diner, realizes that if they save JFK from being shot by Lee Harvey Oswald, that the future will be completely changed. And so Jake Epping lives in the past for years and years, hunting and investigating Lee Harvey Oswald so he could save JFK and possibly save the future. But what I love most about this book is it's probably the greatest love story Stephen King has ever written. And the themes and ideas of this story I think are really clever, because a lot of time travel stories have the implication that if you change one thing in the past, the future will be better. And Stephen King kind of takes that assumption of doing one thing in the past makes the future better and flips it on its head. What if the past isn't as easily fixed? What if time is a bit obdurate, as he likes to say? And what if changing one event doesn't make things better? What if it makes things worse? For those who don't like scary stories, I think 11/22/63 is a great place to get involved with reading Stephen King's book. And the love story at the center of this absolutely broke my heart. And for a guy who gets criticized for not writing good endings, this is the best ending he's ever written, in my opinion. All right, that was my top 5 Stephen King books. Again, there are so many books I could have talked about. I have a whole shelf over there. I could have talked about Billy Summers. I could have talked about Dr. Sleep. I love so many of his books, not to mention his short story collections, but I'll leave that for you guys. Please let me know in the comments below what is your favorite Stephen King book, especially one I didn't cover. All right, see you next time.